Hello, my name is Adam Tomasi from Champion Briefs, and this video topic analysis is for the March-April 2024 LD resolution. Resolved, the primary objective of the United States criminal justice system ought to be rehabilitation. I've been in LD long enough to remember that this resolution was basically debated as the January-February 2013 resolution, which was resolved. Rehabilitation ought to be prioritized above retribution in the United States criminal justice system. So it's natural that we recycle topics because we are left with the same human challenges and policy problems from 2013 to now. And just to have a sense of how much has changed, there is going to be some discussion in this topic analysis of recent reform initiatives and also legislation that actually has passed and the differences between when this was debated before and now. There will be a broader historical overview of the criminal justice system and thinking about different philosophies of punishment. And then we're going to think about the resolution itself and how to be strategic about it from an affirmative and negative perspective. Thinking about philosophy cases, critique arguments, policy style arguments, and so on. First, to just define what this resolution is about. This resolution is ultimately about the philosophy of punishment that the criminal justice system should adopt. So the conventional wisdom of prison and of the criminal justice system is if you do the crime, you do the time. So there are laws, one does something illegal, actions have consequences, you go through a trial, found guilty, punished, in prison, serve your time, away from society, and then you're released, and that is ostensibly it. But what that misses is the extent to which, just as socioeconomic conditions played a role in contributing to the factors of crime before one interacts with the criminal justice system, there is also a problem of how people are supposed to re-enter society once they are released. And we live in a society where the lack of empathy for incarcerated people is very strong in some corners of government and in culture and so on. There are so many people around the United States who work with incarcerated people, who have friends and family that are incarcerated, have themselves interacted with the criminal justice system, that are sympathetic to, for instance, the racial inequities that exist in our criminal justice system. So I'm not at all painting a broad brush here about how people treat criminals. But there is this underlying disconnect where, given that people have, in some instances, committed very serious crimes, once somebody is put in prison, it's kind of like, okay, we don't have to think about their life anymore. Their life has been ruined, their life is basically over, and they have functionally received a death sentence in our heads, in our hearts. I'm not saying that to be dramatic, but I'm saying that to indicate that, you know, when someone's released, there is not always regard for making sure that someone has a quality life and is able to contribute to society. Rehabilitation is meant to address that problem because it is meant to provide skills and education and resources, mental health, to enable somebody, once they leave prison, to become a contributing, functioning member of society. And the negative can certainly question that goal. What does it mean to be a contributing, functioning member of society? Well, thinking in very simple terms, being able to work in lawful, gainful employment, having an education where one is able to find meaning, expand their mind, contribute to their community, versus feeling out of desperation that they have to commit various crimes for the sake of survival or, be lashing out against the lack of opportunities. So the idea that people are not born criminals, but rather they are pushed into situations where crime becomes rational. And so understanding how we deal with that problem, because the way that rehabilitation would deal with that problem is to say that we have to provide the skills and abilities and support that would allow somebody to overcome those conditions, those environments that I described. The negative might put forward an alternative view that the solution to crime appearing rational, which is if we assume in Econ 101 terms, a rationally self-interested person that decides that it is in my interest to commit a crime. And that rational self-interest might be counteracted with deterrence. So if the negative is to argue for harsh punishments, a harsh criminal justice system, where to contrast with the affirmative, that might imagine reduced sentences, a more humane criminal justice system, not trying to lock people up and throw away the key, the negative might argue that actually having that severity and having a system that's just punishment and that's it would be potentially more effective at deterring crime. Because of the idea that someone decides, well, before I do this bad thing, let me consider what the consequences would be. Now, that sounds good in theory, but there are many extenuating circumstances and confounding variables that affect the success of deterrence. In the case of juveniles, for instance, so juvenile justice is a whole nother realm of this topic that I think more debaters should consider, even when they're writing plans or just contentions, that the juvenile justice system is primarily built on rehabilitation because of the idea that children under 18 years old do not have fully developed brains. Now, when this argument would be made back in the juvenile justice topic that I debated when I was a novice, I would hear debaters say, well, how can you say that juveniles are irrational if us debaters are under that category and we are fully rational, having an intellectual debate? Well, apart from that gotcha, there is definitely overwhelming scientific evidence that children under the age of 18 do not have fully developed brains. So they are not able to fully regulate their impulses, which would lead to criminal acts. And there is a fascinating discussion about raising the age, which is to raise the cutoff for juvenile justice from 18 to 20 years old to ensure that 21 years old, to ensure that 19 and 20-year-olds are also able to benefit from being in the juvenile justice system, that it's not the moment one turns 18, they're treated as an adult in the criminal justice system, because of the idea that people still need rehabilitation even when they are 18, 19, 20 years old. So that's an interesting discussion too, about whether deterrence is really all that it's meant to be, but the negative should definitely explore the research about harsh sentences and a tough criminal justice system, tough in quotes, that would potentially lower the crime rate. That's going to be one of the biggest negative arguments. Now, thinking about what this resolution also requires the affirmative to do from a fiat perspective, and that just means imagining that the resolution actually happens. Like, we're not trying to debate about whether the federal government under Biden or whether all the states would actually pass this policy. We're not trying to predict or debate about whether this is politically possible or feasible. So if somebody said Congress wouldn't vote for this, that's not a negative argument. We are debating about the morality. That's from the word ought in the resolution. So thinking about fiat, the affirmative is allowed to imagine that the whole criminal justice system prioritizes rehabilitation from an official standpoint, through sentencing guidelines, programs, etc. Not that every single official, every single guard, legislator is going to be wholeheartedly committed to the project and fully implement it to the best of their ability. The negative can still make solvency deficits, but the idea that rehabilitation being a priority would become the official policy of all federal and state prisons, local jails, etc. The affirmative should get to be able to do that, even if on other topics that might seem like utopian multi-actor fiat. Like we can't just unrealistically assume that all of these agents are going to do the same thing. But that's what the resolution is asking us to consider, that kind of radical change. And we should debate about the morality of that change. So I think it's okay for the affirmative to make that argument. The reason this matters is because the resolution does not have a defined actor other than in the United States criminal justice system. The criminal justice system is mostly managed by the states. So there are federal prisons and there are federal sentencing guidelines for federal crimes, which are typically crimes that cross state borders. But most crimes are within the parameters of a state or like a tribe, other jurisdictions. And that ultimately means that those fall under the state prison systems, the state judicial systems, etc. So understanding that the states are mostly going to be the one uniformly implementing the affirmative advocacy, that's just a really important thing to clarify. There is room for the federal government to take action that can be really beneficial. So I'm going to talk about two recent changes that have taken place in the federal legal landscape related to this topic. One actually has a bearing on a plan that I read 11 years ago on the rehabilitation topic, and another which has more ramifications for what it means to prioritize rehabilitation in 2024. So the first has to do with the First Step Act, which was passed in 2018, bipartisan legislation, and it did a variety of things which do move the system in the direction of rehabilitation, but just like the name, it's really just a first step. First step in this instance was, giving prisoners the first step to a second chance, but really this is all incremental reform. It has the Federal Bureau of Prisons conduct risk assessments and need assessments to put prisoners into recidivism reduction programs, which are programs that, as I mentioned with rehabilitation, are intended to enable people to re-enter society and then not re-offend or commit more crimes once they are released. So there's a statistic that like 60% of people who are, 60% of crimes are committed by re-offenders. So someone was incarcerated in prison, and that was supposed to send a message so they were never going to commit a crime again, but then they're released, and then they continue to reoffend, and that has to do with the social conditions I just described. So then people end up back in prison. Also has to do with parole violations, probation violations, which end up also ensnaring people in bureaucratic difficulties. But the idea being that there's this high rate of reoffense that these programs are intended to solve. So that would be one of the common affirmative contentions also, that rehabilitation can help reduce the reoffense rate and therefore reduce the amount of crime throughout society. The First Step Act also involves reforms like increasing incentives for good time credit. So being able to take time off one's sentence through good behavior, making that easier. Getting rid of solitary confinement for juvenile offenders in federal prisons, because solitary confinement is widely seen as essentially a human rights abuse by many organizations. So especially for juveniles, thinking about solitary confinement not being a good idea, the death penalty even, which the Supreme Court had ruled against for juveniles on the basis of the developmental argument. And then also the First Step Act reduces mandatory minimums for drug offenses. So mandatory minimum sentences come from that retribution style of criminal justice, which is for certain crimes that are considered by the society to be serious. So in this case, possessing a large amount of drugs with the intent to distribute, which has to do with the quantity of illegal drugs that one possesses. So that has a mandatory minimum sentence, as in the judge, if someone is found guilty of that crime, cannot sentence somebody to anything less than that minimum, because it's intended to say, we just want this to be like a flat, severe punishment. You can go above the minimum, but there has to be a clear baseline to send a message. And this has been part of the war on drugs, which has historically been one of the roots of mass incarceration in the United States and the enormous racial disparities in the criminal justice system when it comes to arrest, policing, and the disproportionate prison populations, which has resulted in unique and systemic harms for Black and brown people in the United States. So understanding how the US government can start to wind down the war on drugs by prioritizing rehabilitation and by reducing mandatory minimum sentences is something that the First Step Act has taken a literal first step towards. But there's still room for the affirmative to do more. Now, the second change, which is very fascinating, is one having to do with college educations in prison. So on the January-February topic back in 2013, I read a plan that I loved, which was to have the federal government repeal the ban from 1994 on prisoners being able to receive Pell Grant assistance, federal student loans for low-income college students. And because prisoners have basically $0 of income, if prisoners were able to receive Pell Grant funding, which they were prior to 1994, with the Clinton crime bill, it was like one sentence in this 700-page bill that said, oh yeah, and prisoners can no longer get Pell Grant funding, again, because of this tough on crime mindset, that, prisoners were being locked out of the opportunity to take college courses while in prison and get degrees that they could then use to re-enter society. And that was such a cool affirmative because of all the great cards that were written about the benefits of providing Pell Grant funding to prisoners as a form of rehabilitation. And in 2016, during the Obama administration, so fast forward 3 years, pilot programs by the Department of Education to have Pell Grant assistance for prisoners started to be rolled out. Under the Trump administration, this had not been changed because I guess if it's just a good, successful idea, sometimes that just slips through the cracks if people don't talk about it. And finally, with there was a law in 2020 which had established for good that the federal ban on Pell Grants for prisoners would be repealed and that prisoners could now receive that assistance. So there's been an uneven rollout by the states, and there are still barriers that exist to pursuing educations in prison, which the affirmative can argue need to be addressed. Like, we need to do a full commit to college education in prison, and therefore the affirmative advocates that we provide the commitment necessary to ensure that the Pell Grant funding can succeed now. But that's been a huge change compared to back when this was previously debated. So when we think about like different concepts that the affirmative and negative want to use to debate this topic, and this is where I'm going to talk about a variety of different positions and jump around a little bit. Before I do that, I just want to talk about some other philosophies of punishment other than the ones that I mentioned. So I've mentioned rehabilitation. I've mentioned retribution, which is supposed to be a remedy to vengeance or vigilante justice. Two different things. Vengeance just being the personal desire for revenge, right? Somebody has wronged you, they burned down your house, so you really want to go and burn down their house, right? Vigilante justice would be somebody taking the law into their own hands. So trying to deliver justice themselves. And that mindset has had terrible consequences in the United States, especially when we think about the long history of racism. But in terms of prisons being intended as a way for the public to replace vigilantism or personal vengeance with a system built on due process rights and people that do terrible things get, taken away from society, that's also related to incapacitation, which is another philosophy of punishment, just that, the incarceration aspect would be necessary to deal with crime. Rehabilitation does not necessarily, it does not have to dispute the incapacitation element, even though alternatives to incarceration are one of the big programs implemented as a form of rehabilitation. So the affirmative can consider diversion programs, which try to prioritize alternatives to being in prison that are still sufficient to properly punish somebody for a crime and ensure that they are able to re-enter society in a way that's cost effective for the criminal justice system and also not excessive, like a mandatory minimum for drug possession. Now, when we think about the alleged necessity of incarceration, it is really helpful to both sides to consider the prison abolition position that prisons are obsolete. As the title of the book by Angela Davis, Are Prisons Obsolete?, poses, which is that prisons are an oppressive institution built on confinement and warehousing people, banishing them from society, instead of solving the root causes of crime in the unequal social conditions, and structural violence and oppression. So understanding then how prisons can be replaced with an alternative which is able to reduce harm and violence without maintaining a system that is just built on putting human beings behind bars, that can be a really fascinating route for both the affirmative to say that rehabilitation is about alternatives to incarceration and expanding that, or for the negative to say that the affirmative is still wedded to an unjust prison system and that the primary purpose of the criminal justice system should be to not exist as it presently does, as opposed to rehabilitation. So both sides are definitely going to have to think about philosophically, what is the criminal justice system for? And can it ever be made legitimate? Is rehabilitation still net beneficial? These are all questions that will have to be debated. Now, when we think about the concept of rehabilitation ensuring that reoffense rates can be lowered and that people are able to get education, employment, and re-enter society, there are quite fascinating utilitarian arguments for the affirmative, that rehabilitation will increase societal welfare because you'll have more people that are working and not committing crimes, and that's going to save lives, and that's going to improve the economy. You could even drill down to certain industries that would benefit from an influx of more skilled labor that would come from people that have served their prison time and now have college degrees or have been rehabilitated. So lots of avenues to consider from a utilitarian standpoint. The negative can do the same with deterrence. They can also make arguments about federal spending or state budgets, that rehabilitation will be expensive, and that there are studies that show that the money that's spent on the criminal justice system directly trades off with money that is put into public colleges and universities. So there is a statistical relationship between the more money is put towards prisons, the less money is put towards public schools. So that could be the impact on either side for a spending argument about cost effectiveness or the affirmative increasing spending. I also want to share that there is a philosophical version of a util AC, which focuses not on rehabilitation as a policy, but rather that rehabilitation is a utilitarian philosophy of punishment. So when we think about the purposes of punishment, rehabilitation is a utilitarian concept. Something like retribution is a deontological concept, because retribution says that if you freely choose to violate another person's rights, you should be punished and your freedom should be restricted because you violated someone else's freedom. So rectifying the imbalance of freedom, the violation of someone's rights, that's where punishment comes into play as inherently valuable. The affirmative is saying that punishment doesn't have this intrinsic meaning. It's not just about vindicating that guilty people have been given what they deserve, but rather that punishment has to have societal benefits. So rehabilitation would have greater societal benefits. And the affirmative can say that rehabilitation is a utilitarian philosophy. So if I prove for the next 5 minutes and 59 seconds of my case that util is true, that means that rehabilitation has to be the primary purpose of the criminal justice system, because you're basically defining rehabilitation as util. That's a fascinating strategy that might have fallen out of favor the way that debate goes now in terms of less abstract philosophy debate, but that is an interesting strategy. If the negative is thinking about deontological positions, they really can think about retribution and a related concept of just deserts. And dessert there is spelled like desert with one S, but it is pronounced dessert like chocolate cake. So make sure that you're saying that correctly. Now, thinking about just desserts, thinking about retribution, the negative can argue both that the primary purpose of the criminal justice system needs to be incarceration for its own sake, in terms of holding people accountable. And then they can also argue that there is an underlying problem of indeterminate sentencing with rehabilitation, which, because rehabilitation is meant to be more flexible in terms of, instead of having mandatory minimums, it's meant to say, well, we can be flexible based upon someone's unique needs or risk or when their rehabilitation is concluded. So in the 60s, when the most common form of rehabilitation was cognitive behavioral therapy, the idea was that someone would be held in an institution until they have been mentally cured, and then they can be released. So there were some criticisms of that were like, that violates fairness in the system, because how is someone able to know how long they're going to be institutionalized? Because experts are just going to hold someone indefinitely until they think that their curing has been finished, right? So that criticism of rehabilitation with indeterminate sentences and it not working, as these critiques were made in the 1960s, 1970s, coupled with a spike in violent crime, was like, those elements contributed to this wave of tough on crime, where it was very politically popular to say that you were going to run for office in order to do the absolute worst to criminals. But now things are shifting more from tough on crime to smart on crime, which is, we should consider rehabilitation because it increasingly seems more like common sense. But the negative can still argue that the indeterminate sentencing problem is still an issue, and that we have to respect due process rights, because we don't we want to hold people accountable. So we don't want sentences that are too short, the negative can say, but we also don't want sentences that are like long and have no determinate end. And therefore, like, prisoners' due process rights, which you still deserve, like, even if you've committed a crime, you still deserve due process rights under the Constitution, that, due process rights are not just for innocent people, that those rights need to be respected. So it's like both sides of the coin the negative can speak to. And then that prison abolition critique that I mentioned before, really fascinating argument. The negative can also consider a version of it that's a counterplan. So the argument about restorative justice, which is actually in the champion briefs, among all the other arguments that I've described in this analysis, the idea being that instead of prioritizing incarceration, which rehabilitation also does, we should have a system where offenders are meant to interact face-to-face with the people they've harmed or the affected families, parties, communities, and commit to holding themselves accountable to a process by where they rectify the harm that they've caused. So somebody steals from another person. Under restorative justice, they would have to return the things they stole, or if they no longer have them, to compensate the person, to commit to doing that over some length of time, and working to repair the damage that they have caused in some form. And while that may not work for every crime, there are very fascinating articles and organizations that speak about success stories of restorative justice and how this should be the priority of the criminal justice system, instead of an approach that just banishes people away and, is retributive or even rehabilitative and just leaves the prison system intact. So the negative could absolutely consider a K-oriented strategy as opposed to one that is more retributive and more about harsh punishments. I also want to talk about another interesting angle on this topic, which has to do with the death penalty, capital punishment. So capital punishment is not universally allowed in all the states, but it is fascinating to think about how rehabilitation interacts with it. So on the one hand, the affirmative can say that rehabilitation, if prioritized, would eventually lead to the abolition of the death penalty, because you can't really rehabilitate people if they're being sentenced to death, because they cannot re-enter society. So if rehabilitation is about people re-entering society, then we cannot have the death penalty. Arguably, that means we also cannot have life without parole, which is a permanent, undoable life sentence, where one would not even be able to be let out sooner for good time served or anything else. There are instances where people, when they are very old, are given compassionate releases. Like you have a prisoner who is in their late 80s and it's the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic and it's spreading through prisons. But life without parole, no one is, they are never able to re-enter society ever again. And the affirmative could say that just cannot continue. The negative might be able to say, unless they want to argue that the death penalty is good, which the literature does exist, whereas the affirmative would say the death penalty contributes to racial disparities, it fails to deter crime, and it violates international law, human rights, etc. Also, kills people that have been wrongfully convicted. The negative can focus on the deterrence aspect, can focus on this, idea that if somebody murders another person, that they have forfeited their right to life. Very interesting, fascinating debate. But the negative might also be able to say that rehabilitation contributes to a rise in the death penalty. There's one article by Megan Ryan called Death and Rehabilitation from 2013, and this argues that the death penalty is widely considered by many legal doctrines to be rehabilitative insofar as, and this is very dark, people engage in these personal transformations when they are facing death. So the idea that if we prioritize rehabilitation, the system that we have is going to spin that to justify using the death penalty more often. That is a very fascinating link turn and could even be the basis for a whole, independent negative contention. So lots of different angles to think about with this resolution. So on a concluding note, there are many wonderful cases to think about with this resolution, and the concept of rehabilitation in the criminal justice system has a long history and it has been extensively debated for many, many decades. And the great thing about this topic is that you can pretty much find, for any philosopher you're interested in, or anything you're interested in, period, some connection to the criminal justice system and some connection to rehabilitation, to prisons, to criminal justice reform, and so many other overlapping, intersecting themes. So to explore all of these in more depth and to hopefully implement some of the cool ideas from this topic analysis to start winning debates, I really strongly encourage you to check out the champion briefs and subscribe to them for the March-April topic and every resolution this and next season, because from the champion briefs, you will have a voluminous amount of cards at your disposal, which will allow you to execute many of the strategies that I've discussed in this topic analysis. So with that being said, the March-April resolution of the primary objective of the United States criminal justice system ought to be rehabilitation. I wish you luck in all of your debates, and hopefully you get to read some of these cool cases.